Dr. Steve Polzin is the Director of Mobility Research Program here at CUTR. He received his PhD in Civil Engineering Transportation from Northwestern University in 1986. His specialties include public transportation, public policy analysis, transportation planning, systems evaluation, planning process design, and mobility analysis. And with that, let me turn it over to Steve. Steve?
Thank you, Phil. I appreciate folks taking the time to join us today, and we'll move ahead. I cheated a little bit on the title here. I'm going to talk an awful lot more about the world of change we're in, and really try and plant the seed for the fact that the planning processes need to, one, recognize it, and two, adapt to it, and perhaps be modified somewhat to reflect the reality that, in fact, the world is changing. The other thing I want to, as a preface really, is I'm going to share with you a great deal of data, and we're not going to get into detail in a lot of the data. It is available for download, but the picture I want to paint with the data is, in fact, that the world is changing, that we're seeing some perhaps differences that are more significant than we might have witnessed in the past, and we, of course, need to respond in terms of our planning process with changes accordingly. I see, Phil, one of the slides didn't make it through the translation here with the missing box, but anyway, this is an outline, and you'll see several boxes and some interrelationships here. There we go. And the first part of the talk will really focus on the things on the left-hand side of the screen, what's going on in population and the relationships that travel to the economy, and some issues of technology and how that might be influencing travel. And then I'm going to shift over and talk about the items on the right-hand side, what's going on in terms of our goals and expectations for transportation, some issues relating to the supply of transportation going forward. Clearly related to that is cost, and of course also related to the supply is the transportation revenues. So as you can see here, I've got all kinds of interrelationships defined, and that's kind of one of the realities that we're facing these days. We do have a very complex set of relationships that govern transportation and the delivery of transportation services. So with that, let me proceed through a little bit of a preview of some data and a kind of a walk through history just to appreciate some things. A lot of the data that I'm going to use today, it does come from the National Household Travel Survey, and these next few slides just recap the history. This is a valuable data set because we do happen to have multiple data points that go back to 1969. And you can see that things like the first computer messages or documented computer-to-computer communications in 69, Walmart Incorporated in 69, Apple Computer in 1977, which happens to be the year of the second National Household Travel Survey. Now, if any of you bought Walmart and Apple stock back then, you wouldn't need to be worrying about continuing education right now. But you'll see here 83 data. Interestingly, the very first mobile phones introduced, and obviously those have had a very significant impact on transportation. And things like the first minivan, it's sometimes makes you realize you're not as old as you thought when Word and Lotus were first released in '83. And then you can see some of the data in terms of some interesting items like cost of gas in these graphics. And I'll move to a graph later on that paints that picture. The other 2 years for which we have data are 95 and 2001, and some obviously significant things happening there. And we're starting to see things like the increase in home costs and gas prices. All the while, we're seeing fairly dramatic increases in vehicle availability and travel. The most recent survey was the 2009 one, mostly data collected in 2008. And some things are changing here that influence travel travel as well. Things like Facebook is a social media phenomenon that does in fact impact travel. The use of the internet, a little perhaps disheartening to see that the highest uses of the internet were for searches on Britney Spears and World Wrestling, but nonetheless an important media and tool for transportation planning. And then looking ahead, you know, a lot of the planning work deals with the future, and you know, we're faced with uncertainties, including when we're going to have transportation reauthorization, but also uncertainties as to demographics, fuel costs, the strength of the economy, etc. You know, technology keeps changing. Here, hypothetically, we'll be on Apple phone operating system 8, version 7 sometime in the future. You know, somebody might develop a personal teleportation application, and then, of course, we don't need to worry about planning transportation. We can just transport ourselves, and we can all retire. But the reality is that's not likely to happen. So, in all probability, we'll be faced with having to plan for and meet the needs of future generations. So here's a little bit of some of that data that was on the previous slides laid out for you to take a look at. You can see some of these trends over time with the interesting blip up in gas costs, the peak in '08. But, you know, some nice relatively steady upward trends and relationships. The top couple graphs in this one I'll draw your attention to. Vehicle miles traveled increasing over time with some saturation and slowing of that. This, of course, is not every year's data, so the actual break in the curve appears from other sources to be about 05, 06. And then, of course, VMT per person had been growing quite dramatically, has stopped growing, in fact, has ticked down slightly. A very potentially significant implication to transportation planning as we go forward. A lot of that is underlain with some demographic trends. Household size trends over time. We've seen more small households, aging population, greater baby boomers in the workforce, more urban population. Some of these phenomenon that we've talked a lot about again over the past couple of decades, but in some ways these have played themselves out as well. This one, household with siblings, is a slide I use just to paint the picture of really how different the world might be between 2000 and 1960. And when you think of socialization and kids and travel, an awful lot of travel is taking kids to play with friends. You know, it used to be that 20% of households had 4 siblings in the house, meaning there was enough and, you know, just kids in the house for a basketball team. Now it's only 5% of households. So obviously, as households get smaller, for example, the needs and desires of kids to socialize mean that there's travel associated with that, more so than used to be the case. And again, just one of the observations on you know, evolving demographic trends over time. Dramatic growth in vehicle ownership, no surprise to anybody involved in transportation, but again, we are now appearing to have reached some saturation there. More diverse population, some relative stability in multifamily, single family, and also population size by MSA size. You can see that we don't appear to be growing the biggest cities necessarily. Urban areas are still growing, but not necessarily the largest ones, which adds an interesting wrinkle. This was a graph that I've used. It's a little bit complicated to understand, but it points out the fairly significant changes that occur in our understanding, and this happened to be various forecasts for the state of Florida population for various reference points. And the thing that struck me is when you look at forecasts for 2010, the 1995 forecast was over 2 million too low. And that's a lot. The 2006 forecast for 2010, now that was only 4 years before 2010, and it was 1.12 million too high. And in an 18 million population, that's quite a variance for a 4-year forecast. And if you look at the 2025 numbers across these various sources, you'll see a range of as many as 5 million people. Well, obviously, that degree of uncertainty has some implications in terms of what do we plan for, what kind of infrastructure investments do we make, and obviously what if we pick the wrong point and we're dramatically wrong? Is our decisions still robust and productive decisions in terms of infrastructure investments? Here's some data on the increments of travel demand growth over time. This happens to be vehicle miles of travel, and you can see historically we've had relatively similar sized increments of annual growth in travel, with some exceptions in the gas price years and gas shortage years here, and obviously 2008 the same thing. 2011 year to date through May, we're down about 1% in VMT, but clearly it's a different kind of relationship here, and perhaps going forward as well. Here are some graphs. Some of these, a few of you may have seen in previous materials I presented. These are trip length data and trip rate data, two of the fundamental metrics of person travel, and you can see here where trip rates, the number of trips taken annually per person, have started declining, lower than in the peak 95 data that we have from NHTS, and trip length has been relatively stable, fluctuated a little bit, but has been relatively stable over that time period. So in spite of suburbanization, we haven't seen a dramatic change in trip length. Similarly, I'm going to click through some data on the various travel modes, and you can see that walking has shown not surprising declines, but that appears to have turned itself around as well in the mid-90s for various reasons, perhaps recognition of the health effects, etc. And part of this might be the fact that we've been much more aggressive in probing in our interviews to find out what kind of walking trips taking place. So we're not sure the full behavioral change versus data quality changes there. But we do have also walking data from the American Community Survey. And again, it does show obviously a dramatic historical decline in walking to work, but now some signs of stabilization in that trend. It can't obviously drop as much as it's dropped in the last 40 years. There's simply too small a population left walking, but certainly some positive signs that it's stable. Vehicle occupancies are another one that the shared ride folks, they've been declining, and they showed some signs of stabilization and turnaround for all trips. However, interestingly, work trip occupancy continues to appear to be declining in spite of a turn in some of the other non-SOV modes that doesn't appear to have applied to auto occupancy for commuting. Some discouraging news there. And that shows up in American Community Survey data as well, where the percent of folks riding with someone has declined, and that's something that we're real interested in understanding. How come that mode, which would seem to be both resource and environmentally attractive, simply hasn't captured or stabilized in terms of its share. Here's the transit data. The top is all trip purposes, or excuse me, the top is work trip purposes, and you can see the historic declines there. We're stabilized at about 5% work trip, some turnaround from what appeared to be the low points in the mid-90s to 2000 time period, and of course some risk as we speak with very tight budgets for transit agencies. The lower line is transit use for all trip purposes. Again, historic declines, but some evidence of a turnaround. And again, this is multi, the date is about a 6 or 7 year increment here. Some of these trend breaks were actually at midpoints if you match it up with field count data. So you can't use too much precision on these graphs because we don't have continuous data. A couple observations on transit use. The newest data shows what industry folks have known. Transit mode use is dramatically higher for households that have limited vehicle availability, and that's sustained itself, that phenomenon, in the 2008 data, with in some ways even more pronounced dependency of folks on or dependent folks being a predominant transit market. Obviously, a strong relationship continues between transit use and income as well, and that as much as we hope that starts to change and that we're more competitive for choice travelers, that's not showing up in aggregate data at this point. This is a graph that compares the market share of total transit travel by auto availability, and if you look at the green, or excuse me, the blue and light blue shares, this combined to about 45% of transit trips are made by folks with 0 cars in 2001, and that's grown to about 48% now. So it gives you some idea that as much as, again, we'd like to be able to capture more choice riders, the current aggregate national data isn't showing that at this point in time. Vehicle availability, there's lots of different ways to measure this with different denominators. As you can see from this data, it was strong growth in vehicle availability, really kind of through the 80s, and some stability in vehicle availability since that point in time. Actually, some slight declines more recently, and we're seeing that. And there was some data released for Florida just within the last few weeks that talked about fewer registered vehicles, and the same affordability problem that's impacting folks in terms of home ownership is for some situations resulting in declining vehicle availability at the household level as well, which is, again, contrary to a multi-decade trend that we've been observing in the past. Some of that may be choice decisions as well. We don't have the data necessarily to sort that out at this point in time. Here's data on declining zero-vehicle households. Again, a strong metric when you're trying to understand transit use, and as you can see here, some evidence from NHTS of a reversal of that trend with growing transit dependency, or growing zero-vehicle households, and this has been highly correlated with declining transit share over the years. So, and not that we necessarily aspire to have more folks that don't have cars out of financial need. It certainly at least creates the prospect that transit can sustain itself a little bit easier because it won't have the same pressures it's had of greater auto availability, attacking its market share. Here's some interesting data on where the car ownership fits in the population, and when you think about policies that perhaps might influence auto ownership or those kinds of things, you need to recognize that an awful lot of households, over 20%, have more cars than they do adults, and those are folks that might have specialized vehicles, the convertible for weekends, the truck for pulling the boat kind of thing, and so getting rid of a vehicle may not necessarily influence their travel behavior because there's an excess of vehicles in those households. A significant share, about 54%, have comparable numbers of vehicles as they do adults in the household, and then of course some 16% with fewer cars than adults in the household. And obviously, depending on exactly what age brackets you use, and if you could look at workers and not adults, but it tells you some things about where vehicle ownership is and what the implications might be. Here's another graphic that looks at time spent on travel. Again, we're coming off a period of sustained upward increases in people's willingness willingness to commit time to travel, and that curve broke, and it broke significantly with an actual decline between 2001 and 2008 data, and again, perhaps portends a real different future, and certainly some risks with anything approaching straight line extrapolation of historical data in terms of some of these variables. This is a little piece of work we did looking at travel as a function of income distribution, and we hear a lot about the relative wealth of various quintiles or quartiles of the population and what it might mean in terms of the economy, etc. Well, it has implications in terms of travel too, and you can see here that 4 of the 5 quintiles had relatively modest to none in terms of income growth over time in constant dollars, and an awful lot of the aggregate wealth was accumulating in the top quintile. And of course, the logical thing to do then is to look and see what's been going on in terms of travel for those various population groups. And this is some work that Dr. Chu did for us that looks at these quintiles using NHTS data and looking at their travel rates for the reference periods. And interestingly, you can see those 4 bottom quintiles showed declining travel. The top quintile that showed the predominant growth in income continued to show total travel growth, person miles of travel growing. So clearly the relationship between wealth and travel is sustained. It may not be as powerful a relationship as in the past, but obviously a huge share of the population without a lot of growth in wealth hasn't been able to afford the activities and the cost of travel, and that may in fact be part of the result that we've seen the slowing and declines of growth. Here's travel by age, and the couple things that I really want to draw folks' attention to here in terms of what's been going on more recently are the changes in travel per capita between 2008 and 2001. And as you can see by the circled area on the graph, the big declines appear to have been in the young working adult age groups, the 20 to 40-year-old type of folks. Those appear to be folks that are traveling substantially less than was previously the case. A little bit here, but not nearly as much. And interestingly, if you look at the kind of the post-55-year-olds, they don't appear to have had their travel influenced very much over the past 7-year period as a result of changes that were taking place. And now, these are folks that are more likely to be established in their home and job and have assets and vehicle availability is constant, etc. And these are folks that are more likely to be, more leveraged personally, more susceptible to a tough economy, etc. And to some extent, perhaps adapting, environmentally sensitive, perhaps more technology savvy and willing to use technology as a substitution for travel. And so it'll be very interesting to see how this translates over time and works its way into the broader population, and if in fact we see that downward trend in travel. Interestingly, if you look at what's being said in kind of traditional media, there's an awful lot of things going on that relate to the economy and that have some obvious implications in terms of future travel and travel demand. And this is just some examples of some headlines, and these we pulled literally within 1 month of each other. Earlier this year, traditional households, which is mom, dad, and kids, are waning. Low home ownership levels, high debt levels for recent grads moving back home, not the same household formation. huge Hispanic population, continued growth, and some prospects of a tough housing market for a decade or more. Some other, impact on car buying with young adults, staycations, birth rate drops associated with the economy, the strong role for women in the job force, and that's even been exacerbated with unemployment here, hitting males more aggressively, and obviously some gas prices impacts on retail sales and other activities. So some interesting things going on there. I'm personally of the belief that we're now at a point where we may see a significant change in travel because of technology and substitution effects. And there's been research in the past, and usually it's suggested that it's a neutral effect. There's been some very good work by Pat Montarian that's kind of explored it. But I think we're reaching a critical mass point, and I think this is going to be one that's worth watching going forward, because it does have an impact on future travel demand. And some interesting things: eHarmony's responsible for 5% of marriages, 30% of couple meetings. Online shopping growing, cell phone use growing, Facebook use growing, online distance learning growing quite significantly, online purchases by young folks growing. And these are a couple examples I've used. Both Blockbusters and Borders have gone through financial reorganizations and failures of sort lately, and the reason they have is in both cases those media that they distributed have gone to e-media, basically, to e-commerce, and those trips to Blockbuster that used to be non-trivial. Anybody that drove past a Blockbuster 10 years ago knows they were crowded places, and same things with Borders. Well, now it's Netflix and Kindles, and that travel's gone away for the most part. Even things like lately the post office is contemplating a 5-day-a-week delivery instead of 6. Well, that's a significant cut in their travel, obviously, if that's the case, because their volume is going to electronic communications as well. Again, this just summarizes some of the things we've talked through. Some very significant changes, perhaps some multi-decade trends coming to an end here, and some interesting aspects of supply here with affordability and energy cost, etc., having some impacts. Now I'm going to shift to the right-hand side of the graph here. We've looked a little bit at the demand side, so now let's look a little bit at the supply side. And I don't have as much technical information here, so we'll share at least some observations. And one of these, this is a disclaimer I use whenever I get asked to talk about future travel, but I think it's important as transportation planners that we, in effect, defend ourselves, as it were. We don't have a good ability to predict who's going to win the next election, and which fall TV premieres will be popular, and what will be the hot Christmas gift, and or what, if any, will be the hot stocks this year. And there's massive amounts of consumer research and survey and technical analysis, etc., that goes into these. I would argue probably far more than gets invested in travel behavior research, and yet with very mixed results. And yet there's a tendency to expect professionals to forecast travel by mode and time of day and technology for a 30 perhaps longer span time frame, and we need to acknowledge that the world is changing right now, and we need to be a little bit careful about implying that we can be very precise about doing that in light of the uncertainties that we're seeing, particularly now, and ultimately it does suggest that we need to plan for uncertainty in the future and really look towards having robust plans. So I'm going to reveal my future demand forecast here on the next page. Anyway, in addition to the challenge of understanding future demand, the industry right now is faced with a real challenge because we've got such a complex set of goals for transportation. And not only are they complex, but in some cases they are in fact conflicting, and particularly some of the environmental sustainability goals do in fact conflict with the mobility goals. Obviously there's some solutions that are more compatible with both goals than others, but nonetheless there's some very real challenges there, and you see it in attitudes and goal statements of agencies, etc. And it's very challenging for planners to find solutions that are necessarily consistent with these objectives and still economically and behaviorally viable solutions to mobility challenges that we face. So it is a as I say, we've over the years, as we've learned more about transportation, our complexity of decision making results from this applying holistic thinking to transportation planning. We now realize just how important it is to all aspects of life. Environment, health, safety, mobility, accessibility, equity, climate change, employment, economic competitive, urban image of areas, etc., land use choices, etc. So we grasp that, and we've tried to embrace that in a lot of our planning. And part of that's, at least contributed to the contentiousness of decision making and the complexity of decision making, because at least some of these challenging goals end up being very partisan issues, or at least raising partisan issues. Historically, transportation goals were relatively simple: safety, capacity, cost effectiveness, etc. Those tended to be strong bipartisan goals, but our goal sets are much more complex, and some aspects of that have led us to having a much more partisan environment for transportation planning decision making. Here's a simple graphic that I did. Whoopsie, I meant to. That just kind of satires the national transportation priorities and how they've changed over the past decade or two. Each administration or fraction of administration seems to rebadge some of their priorities and goals, and it does make it challenging to have consistent long-term programs that accomplish broader objectives in light of that very dynamic situation in terms of issues. Unprecedented uncertainty in travel behavior, demographics, economic growth, technology change, and governance. And we've touched on a lot of the behavior and demographics, a little less so on the economics, although I painted a picture of how significant that is. But I think for the first time in a long time, folks are having serious questions about the pace of economic growth going forward, and some of the challenges. The role of deployment of technology, not only in terms of its impact on the modes and their cost and environmental impact, but the substitution effect in particular is certainly an interesting phenomenon. And governance issues, the whole role of the various levels of government in the provision of transportation, the relationship between government and the private sector, those are all being fundamentally revisited and rethought. So it's a very complicated time. Oftentimes the cynicism that the public has with government in general has carried over into transportation, and things like bridge to nowhere, etc., become rallying points and symbols of some failings in various elements of transportation, and some tough times finding a meeting between the public will and the professional and technical needs. And I would argue that the industry has sometimes failed to discern the difference between worthy and imprudent projects. That in some ways the industry's been complicit in not really putting itself in a position of articulating clear priorities and goals, and sometimes a little too eager to get the resources and implement anything that somebody's willing to fund, as opposed to projects that make sense. This particular picture is just a sample of some of the various studies that have been done over the past few years to try and paint a picture of a way forward in terms of funding transportation. And these are some, very well-researched studies by some very bright folks that care a lot about transportation. They're full of good ideas, but the reality is we're still looking at extensions, and we still don't have reauthorization, and there's some strong differences in strategies and perspectives of how we move ahead in funding transportation. Like I said, lots of good people working hard to come up with solutions, but nothing that's at least built a consensus to move forward with at this point in time. Another kind of intriguing aspect of the funding for transportation issue is just a few weeks ago, the administration announced new CAFE standards for autos, and subsequent to that, they've done the same thing for heavy vehicles. It was a very aggressive standard relative to some of the speculation and expectations that moves it to light cars and trucks to 54.5 mpg by 2025. Well, 2025 isn't very far away, and this particular analysis happened to note that that has the prospect of declining fuel tax revenues, obviously, by $65 billion in revenues. So some very, very significant implications of that, and will certainly beg rethinking mechanisms for funding transportation going forward, as well as some real challenges when you're operating cars that are getting 54 miles per gallon. The whole environmental arguments and modal differences start to come into question. Can other modes continue to improve their environmental effectiveness and efficiencies as fast so as to stay competitive, etc. And some real challenges for things like transit, for example, in light of the kinds of autos we'll be driving in a few decades from now. I'm going to share a few slides on costs. Again, just to paint the picture, here's an example of the relatively dramatic increases in construction costs. And this is the the price index for street and highway construction, the producer price index. This doesn't incorporate the cost increases associated with different design standards. So this is just the pure construction side, and on top of this, one would need to layer the level of increased investment to add smart technology or greater amenities, etc., that we've continued to add to our transportation infrastructure. So as much as this is a steep upward slope, it probably understates the real impact of increasing costs on construction. And you'll notice obviously the bubble here, the dramatic decline. A lot of folks talking about how prices are coming in 20, 30, 40% lower. But again, we're back on an upward slope that's interestingly similar in slope to what had been the case before. Now, they did discontinue this particular metric and came up with a slightly new one down here. So over time, obviously, we'll have more years of data for that metric as well. But again, a tough environment there. Diesel fuel is a major both contributor to construction costs, but as well as highly correlated with it. And you can see the price trend here for diesel fuel as well. One of the things that we look at in some work we do for FDOT is the competition for construction resources and the impacts that might have on the costs for roadway construction, at least in Florida in the mid last decade. Competition from housing and commercial building was putting pressure on roadway construction costs, and obviously we've had some significant changes as it relates to that. And here's some examples of housing, the decline in housing permits and pricing, and obviously that's lessened competitive pressure for various materials as well as some of the construction labor. So that's partly explains why we've gotten some awfully good deals. Those of you from Florida and frankly most of the rest of the country know that land values have come down quite dramatically as well. So if you're cash rich and need right away for new projects, now might not be a bad time to do it. So we have had some benefits there. Interestingly, I haven't seen any data that suggests planning, engineering, project management costs have changed. I know it's a more competitive market now, so I suspect it has some, but I haven't seen any quantification of that. Also, there's some interesting evidence, or at least anecdotal evidence, that the larger, arguably a little less complex market for roadway construction has really, responded to the lesson pressure. Less so seems to be the case for high-tech transit technology. The rail projects across the country don't seem to be having quite the same extent of softening prices as we're seeing on the roadway side. Again, I haven't run any hard numbers on that. That's just an observation from watching the media, but an interesting one that deals with supply and demand in the various modes. Some key issues, some takeaway points, I hope, from the discussion. Well, I'm not suggesting that the kind of the laws of physics and human nature and economic principles have changed. I do think a lot has changed, and I think a lot of the planning industry hasn't necessarily grasped that, or if they've grasped it, they haven't necessarily used that to rethink some of their processes and some of their strategies for planning for the future, and how they might want to respond to that in terms of tactics and strategies and criteria for investment and decision making. Certainly more complex and controversial than previously, and I see that almost on a daily basis, some strong evidence of that and some challenges that introduces, including the ability to communicate it to decision makers and the public in terms of some of the complex trade-offs of health and environment and economics of growth and land use influence, etc. Very complex phenomenon and tough to communicate to folks. Uncertainty is unprecedented, and I don't think that's just a real short-term phenomenon. I think we're going to see that for a while. You'll hear people talk about things like, what's the new normal going to be, and I think it's going to take a decade or so to settle before we really have a strong sense going forward of a number of phenomena that have historically been very important to extrapolating travel behavior and transportation needs. And finally, it really puts the burden on planning to seek out robust solutions, and that there is a growing body of literature about planning in these times of change and how we can position ourselves, what tactics and strategies, what tools, what kinds of projects will be successful for various future scenario outcomes. Ideally, it would be nice to spend a lot of time talking about extrapolating the implications of this into some of those kinds of planning changes, and hopefully we can do that in the future. Finally, I'll share with you a little slide that I've had some fun with here. A mother and some ducks crossing the Great, and some things don't go as planned, and I think as professionals we are kind of in a situation right now where things haven't gone quite as planned over the last decade, and we need to anticipate perhaps some greater uncertainty in the future. So with that, that's the end of the presentation. I'm here to take some questions if we have some, or comments, and be glad to get any feedback you might have. I know we went fast through some technical information. Feel free to download the materials and look that over. If you have any questions, I'm accessible by email. I'll be more than happy to give you any more background on some of those materials. But with that, Phil, do we have any Any questions out there?
Yeah, we will, Steve. I just wanted to remind people how to ask questions. The instructions are on the screen. If you look at the top of your screen, you should see the Q&A. Click on that. Type your question in this area here, and click the word ask, and that will submit the question, and then we'll pull the questions as they come in. And I guess to kind of get us started, Steve, is of all this type of watching all these various trends and looking at a lot of this data, is there anything that particularly surprised you?
I've been looking at it for quite a while, so I'm kind of, over the hump, so to speak, in terms of recognizing that some of these changes are significant and real, and not simply blips in long-range trends, but perhaps major changes in trend lines. So I'm kind of, personally, I'm kind of there. But I guess what does surprise me is the lack of kind of awareness and attention to this in the broader profession, and not just the profession, but the media and others. Some of the changes taking place now are very significant in terms of the context going forward, and I really think it begs some of our generally straight line type extrapolating and trending behaviors in the past, that we really rethink some of those things, and I'd like to see a lot more effort and energy invested in figuring out what we as planning professionals need to do differently, what different data we need, what different tools we need, what different strategies for sorting and evaluating projects and presenting information to decision makers, etc. I think there's lots of challenges there to help us do a better job in an era of very scarce resources and going forward.
Well, you actually kind of filled in the follow-up to that was what worried you. So let me go to another question. When you compare personal travel behavior between 2001 and 2008, how do you separate the effect of recession from trends in travel behavior? The fact that PMT for Gen Xers dropped from 2001 to 2008 could just be due to a greater proportion of them being unemployed than the national average due to their relative lack of work experience.
Good question, Phil. And we the virtue of the NHTS is it is a very rich data source, and this past time with all the add-ons, a pretty nice size sample. So you can do a fair amount of digging down into the data and try and sort out some of those effects. Like any survey, you're always going to have risks of adequacy of sample size and bias in respondents, etc. When we work with the data, we tend to look at the NHTS data, but we also cross-check that with both kind of theories and models of how we think people behave, and i.e., you think, oh, high gas prices, less travel, that's the theory, basic economic supply-demand type relationships. But then we also look at field data. In other words, when we look at transit mode share reported in NHTS, we get a set of numbers, but then we go and we look at things like the National Transit Data Set and transit ridership reported there, and see if the trends, in fact, are tracking in the same direction, and use that to confirm and validate and influence our degree of confidence in terms of drawing conclusions, interpreting the data. So in a number of areas we can do that, and we do that. Some of these phenomenon, will need confirming. We use this survey, for example, to create a lot of hypotheses. Hopefully there will be another survey in 2014, that's the current thinking, that will allow us to then validate whether or not some of those phenomena are in fact maturing and or nuances in the short term. So lots of different things we can do to help us do that as best we can.
Sorry, another question. Will the purchase of foreclosed homes further reduce the amount of travel and possibly help increase the use of transit, since we may not be spreading out as much? Some
interesting observations there, and there are folks, including myself, that are kind of watching that. One of the risks that we have currently is with the job market being as tight as it is, folks are don't have choice in jobs. So if they, if they can get a job by driving farther, they will. So in a lot of ways, this tight job market and the fact that people are locked in their house and the ability to move because it saves you 20 minutes on commuting really goes away, because you're underwater, you can't sell, et cetera, et cetera. So there's at least some factors that kind of have an upward bias on work trip commute length that are economy related. On the other hand, I do think there's some credible evidence that the single-family home trend seems to have kind of stabilized or declined. Most of the commercial interest now is in multifamily structures and rental, and that could persist for quite a while. There's also some folks that have looked at the market for home inventories and have argued that we've built enough large lot single-family homes to last us a decade or two, and that the demand won't be there for those homes, and part of that is not necessarily declining aspiration for those traits, but simple economic realities where there were so much of the market that was in homes that were over their head in terms of affordability, and they're not seeing the income growth that they expected. A lot of people buy a home and they're stretched when they buy it, but they expect raises going forward with constant mortgage costs that that'll get better with time, but with no raises it's not getting better with time. Those kinds of things, I think people are backing off the share of their income that they'll be able to dedicate to home ownership. They'll be needing more of it for savings and retirement and co-pays on health cares and those kinds of things. So I do think it'll lessen pressure for kind of new far-flung suburban development, probably take some pressure off second home ownership for quite a while. So I think there's some positive elements of it too. We haven't been able to kind of tease out the net effect of those phenomena at this point.
All right. Another question for you, Steve, is gets actually to the long-range transportation planning issues. How can metro areas prepare credible long-range transportation plans given the uncertainties in so many variables?
That's really, I think, the gist of the challenge that faces folks. And there's a couple of answers. There's the cynical answer: we don't have resources to spend for build for the future anyway. We're going to be cobbling together everything we can just to sustain the systems and infrastructure we have in place now. So in some senses, the problem is lessened because in a lot of ways, we may not have the ability to build new infrastructure. We may not have the demand. And here again, I mean, if you go back over the past, several decades, about 3/4 of the demand growth in travel has been people traveling more, not more people. And if that piece goes away or moderates dramatically, which is what some of the data is suggesting, at least in the near term, that does lessen the future demand estimates quite dramatically. I mean, there's obviously relocations within urban areas and states, and there's states still growing real fast, but an awful lot of fast growth places like California and Florida aren't fast growth anymore. And if you don't have per capita growth, you still may have a backlog of needs, and you've got your existing system to improve and maintain. So I think it's really going to be kind of place dependent, but a real different paradigm. I think the priorities are going to be on, optimization of existing infrastructure and maintenance of existing infrastructure, and then new capacity, I think, will have to be looked at very judiciously and tested against, various economic scenarios of the future to make sure that, in fact, the markets are going to materialize to support it.
All right, Steve, thank you. And really two more questions. One from, say, for those that are new to the transportation planning field, like recent graduates or students that are still in school. What advice do you give to them looking forward?
A couple things. I think, as much as the job market's looking a little rockier right now, there's an awful lot of talent in the industry that's approaching retirement and in some cases retiring, and there's continues to be just a huge need for people that really have a strong grasp of transportation and analysis tools and data handling and data management, and can interpret it and present it graphically and visually and with GIS tools, etc. So I think there's certainly still real opportunities out there for folks. Transportation is going to continue to be a huge part of the economy and society. It's dynamic, it's exciting. There's technology issues, environmental issues, social need issues. So I still personally think it's going to be a very rewarding career opportunity for folks. The generalist or really the specialist, but specialist in everything is really the key. I mean, it is because of the complexity that I talked about. It means the new workforce needs to be educated in all of these phenomena and factors and understand them and understand the relationships, and that takes lots of hard work and some sharp folks to do that. So it'll continue to be challenging.
Okay, thanks. And kind of our last question, and probably really relevant considering we were offering this this webinar, this webcast. What information do we have about the percentage of telecommuting, and I think you could extend that to the technologies like we're using right now, that is now being done, and what impact do you think those technologies will have on vehicle miles of travel?
Okay, good. A good question, and the simple answer is there isn't a hard answer. A couple things. I mean, the work at home numbers, we do have data on that. It is growing. It's arguably the fastest growing mode in percentage terms, and it's getting significant, to the point where it's passing up transit and walk, and that's a piece of that. The pieces we don't know are some of the other subtle impacts or not so subtle impacts, and even the logistics ones. I mean, lots of people drive cars with navigation now, and do you save a few miles per thousand because you don't turn the wrong way, or you don't get lost, or you don't circle around looking for something, etc. Is the presence of the cell phone so that you can call ahead and schedule your time or your path differently, or be reminded to pick up something on the way home that saves you a trip in the evening. There's a lot of subtle things that are happening out there that might only be fractions of percents in terms of overall person travel, but I think we're starting to see those accumulate and start to become significant. And in the aggregate, if you get a few percent, that's pretty significant in terms of PMT at the national level. And my personal feeling is that we're starting to see the cumulative effect of some of these things starting to add up and explaining part of the slowing down of travel demand growth.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. I hope
sure enjoyed it.
If anybody has additional questions, please do not hesitate to contact Steve. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer. On the screen right now is the evaluation for those that we have applied to get approval to provide certification maintenance credits for under AICP. So if you're interested in those credits, also provide your contact the information at the end of this. We do appreciate the feedback, helps us give us an idea what you'd like to see. There's the future topics, future speakers, or your research needs. And the last closing remark is on our next webinar will be September 8th, dealing with motorcycle crash hotspot analysis. So same link, same telephone number, 2 weeks from today. And with that, on behalf of the Center for Urban Transportation Research at the University of South Florida, we wish you a good day. Thank you.